Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I am your host, Perry Constantine, and we're back here with another episode with another returning guest, and that is Patrick. Patrick Terry, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty well. How are you, Perry?
Doing good. Welcome back to the show. Nice to have you back again.
Thanks. I appreciate you having me on. I look forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, I was because we recorded the episode on Sailor Suit and Machine Gun, back in the summer, and it was just released, a few weeks before we recorded this. So just re-listening to that episode, even a few months later, I was surprised at like how many different things we were able to get to and to find to talk about in that. So I'm really looking forward to jumping back into it again, having the similar discussion with today's movie.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, the talking about Sailor Suit and Machine Gun, I in particular was interested in all the things that were happening in the particularly the 1980s for that film, but just Kadokawa as a figure, and in a very different way. It's really nice to be able to have a chance to talk about Itami Juzo, who is more well known in the States, but still there are films of his that I think have had less exposure, and I think the one that we're talking about today sort of fits into that mold. There was a release of it with English subtitles, so people beyond Japan have had an opportunity to see it, and now at least within the United States and places that have access, it's on the Criterion channel, so people can stream it. So there's a little bit better access to this film than Sailor Suit and Machine Gun and perhaps some of the other films, even like when we think of like the sequels to the Tetsuo series that you've been talking about recently, those are still sometimes a little bit more difficult to get your hands on. So it's nice that, we have this variety, and hopefully, with more conversations, more exposure, there'll be more access to these different films. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to today.
Yeah, I can't remember how I initially stumbled onto this movie, but it was actually just like last year when I first heard about it. I think it was just like looking through different movies to show for my class and getting ideas for different things to talk about with them. And this movie, I think, showed up on one of the one of those top 10 lists of like top 10 Japanese movies or something along those lines. And when I was looking for information about it in Western sources, there wasn't a whole lot. Like, I know it had gotten some critical acclaim overseas, but when it came to trying to find, like US DVD releases or something like that, it seems like the only release was like a VHS copy.
Yeah, and I believe that now, sort of before finding this film, had you seen other Itami Juzo films prior to this? Had you seen any of his other films?
I've seen Tampopo,
okay,
and I just want to double check, see if there's anything else of his I've seen. Tampopo I definitely saw. I don't think I've seen anything else.
Okay,
but I know The Funeral is apparently amazing, and I have to check that out.
Yeah. I mean, it's he's just a really interesting figure. So yeah, I mean, the fact that you've seen Tampopo is I think that's the entry point for most people with Itami's films, and then The Funeral was also pretty successful. I think it did get some festival releases in the United States. So even early on, there was an attempt to get his films sort of seen in a market beyond the domestic sphere, because in some ways the characters in his films had a little bit more of like an easy access of transfer. So there wasn't as much difficulty for people to kind of connect with the characters. So even though The Funeral is looking at a specific type of funeral in Japan, the process of how we grieve or how we deal with the loss of a family member, but equally what we societally expect of ourselves and the people around us when an event like this happens, I think is very translatable. So even if there are specific, cultural specificities, it's a film that, is very easy to understand sort of the challenges that the characters are facing. So yeah, do you know how long ago you remember seeing Tampopo the first time?
The first time I saw it was probably about maybe about like 10 years ago or so. I was actually in Japan at the time, and a friend of mine had it was his favorite Japanese movie, so he brought it over one night and we watched it. And then I hadn't seen it again until maybe about a year or two ago. My wife and I watched it one night. We were trying to find something to watch. And I think actually the last time I watched it, it was after I had already watched Minbo, which is kind of a nice little interesting way to go about it, because I actually, I'm not sure how you feel about this, but I actually found Minbo to be a lot more interesting, a lot more engaging than Tom Popo.
You know, I think the beauty of Itami's films is that depending upon where you are in your life
Mm-hmm.
and what your mood is, his films sort of hit on a range of subject matter. So if you are at a place where you are thinking more about potentially like corruption, society, the way laws, the way not just how society functions but how our legal codes help define our life,
Mm-hmm.
something like Minbo no Ona, or really the one that kind of put him on the map beyond Tampopo, Marusa no Ona, and the sequel,
Is
dealing
that the
with.
taxing woman?
That's right. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Taxing Woman and A Taxing Woman Returns, where you're dealing with basically a woman at the start of the first film is becoming an investigator in the Japanese version of the IRS. And so you're looking at tax fraud, schemes that,
Mm-hmm.
again, kind of border on the Yakuza gangster types that we see, as the central focus of Minbo no Ona, but it's done with a lot more comedic flair on the part of our main actress, Nobuko Miyamoto, who is in the majority of Itami's films as the
Mm-hmm.
sort of central character. And so like there's all these wonderful things, and that's why I think this is going to be a tangential conversation, because the moment I start thinking about Minbo no Ona or something that Miyamoto does in one film, it makes me, think of, Taxing Woman or
Mm-hmm.
Tampopo, or even, their first film, The Funeral, because there is such a close partnership between them as a couple. They met in the 60s and, had a family and a life together, but they still kind of pined to, return to their professional careers. And in the 1980s, they were able to kind of start doing that again and had a very prolific career up until Itami's death. So
Mm-hmm.
they, have, I think, 12 films altogether. And each of them is looking at this different facet of life. You have The Funeral, you have one that's looking at food culture with Tom Popo, the,
Mm-hmm.
tax fraud with Marisa no Ona, the, again, the Yakuza and the way in which sort of the legal system works and doesn't work for
Mm-hmm.
people, and followed up with something that's looking at the health industry and the supermarkets and witness protection. There's just all of these different facets of life that Itami is able to look at very serious subjects, but equally have a bit of either slapstick or light humor sort of injected into all of them. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's why Tom Popo in particular hit so hard, because food culture, you can have something that reminds you of what might be happening in your own country, but then equally you feel like you're getting a window into some of the societal expectations of people in Japan. Whether that's accurate or not, you still feel like you're being given this sort
Mm-hmm.
of close view of what society is or how society functions. And I think Minbo no Ona is one that should have a little bit more light shined on it, because I, like yourself, I was really drawn to it the first time I watched it, because
Mm-hmm.
my route to seeing it was actually in university. And after seeing the sequel to A Taxing Woman, that was the first Itami film I saw, was A Taxing Woman Returns. In the following semester, I was in a completely different course, completely different instructor, and his favorite up to that point was Minbo no Ona, and he had that VHS copy you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
before. So that was the way that I saw it, were with those really kind of fuzzy tracking, a little bit misaligned, and
Mm-hmm.
the hard-coded subtitles on it. But just the sort of the power and the force of Miyamoto as our main sort of and basically poking and prodding the Yakuza, and just seeing how Inoue really sort of is able to fool them and make them look fools, or even more foolish than they already are,
Mm-hmm.
just delighted me over and over again. And it's one that I think that on first viewing can be really enjoyable in just the punch of it, but you can watch it 2, 3, 4 more times and you can pick out a new element each time you watch it. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sort of seeing what were the things maybe on a more recent viewing that stood out to you, and myself. I definitely took down a number of notes as I was watching it again, and just sort of thinking, oh my goodness, he includes this and this
Mm-hmm.
and this.
Yeah, one of the things that I really took from it, I'm just checking out my own notes here, is right in the beginning, just, and this is something I noticed after living in Japan, just the way everybody just ignores what's happening right in front of them. Right, the Yakuza are causing this whole big scene in the hotel. The hotel staff is clearly flustered. They don't know what to do about it. And in the background, you've just got all these people just sitting there calmly, just like reading their newspapers and having their coffee or whatever, and just completely pretending like none of this is happening. And it's just,
Right.
there was such a powerful metaphor for how Japanese society, especially at that time, reacted to the Yakuza. It was just kind of like this out of sight, out of mind, even when it happens right in front of your face.
I mean, and that's something that, definitely I experienced living in Japan, of, what seemed to be something that would cause attention or be a commotion that, as a group you can ignore. But I feel like that translates to other cultures too. Like someone could be like in distress or in pain, and there's almost like a group mentality that, no one really wants to sort of get in the middle of that, like whether it's like a shouting match on a bus, or someone maybe tripped and fell on the street. There might be someone that helps them out, but if there's a big enough group, there's almost this strange tension that sort of builds up. Whereas if it was one person like you or I and someone fell, we'd probably run right over to try to help and see if they were all right. So there is something about that group mentality of, we don't want any trouble, don't bother us, let us be. Well, if I just keep my head down, maybe we can just move past this. Where the Yakuza, at least within the world of this film, are exploiting that to no end. That if any time they're told that they have to change their behavior, you immediately make a bigger scene so that very quickly the staff is doing anything they can to sort of calm them down, whether it's from, the verbal commands or, most often the money bribes that they've been had been given and continue to be given through the early portion of the film.
Right. Yeah. The whole diffusion of responsibility.
Right.
When you're in a group, like even, the famed, mostly apocryphal story of Kitty Genovese, who was being attacked and raped in the apartment courtyard. And apparently other people had heard about it and they were watching and nobody had called the police, which turns out in retrospect, that was mostly apocryphal. People actually did call the police. So, but there were like problems with police response or something along those lines, but it wasn't what, but you do see, I remember one time when I was still in the States, there was this massive car accident when I was on the road. Like a car just completely flipped over, and everyone else obviously stopped, and we're all just get out of our cars, and for like a good 5 minutes, all of us are just standing there watching, right? Because everybody's so shocked and waiting. Like, well, should I do something or should I wait for someone else to do something?
And then beyond that, the idea that if you're living in a society that has laws, rules, regulations, you can easily pass off your own personal sense of responsibility to do something when the expectation is that as a city, we've established police, fire stations, other types of volunteer groups, things that are beyond us that have an actual systematic, role in the city, in the society to handle these types of incidents. And in certain ways, that's what we have in this hotel being this sort of microcosm of all of the things that are happening in society, so that when you have this rebellious element of the Yakuza in there, it all of a sudden is not on the individual patrons to directly say like, hey, you're being too loud, can you please be quiet? But not unlike if you're going to a theater and maybe someone was being too loud, or when we used to go to theaters, but be able to talk directly, that usually could potentially lead to more trouble. So then you pass that off to someone in some type of either administrative role or in a role of either security, management, something that's beyond you, that is connected with the place that you're in, the organization that you're a part of. So this hotel staff then, as we see, they are scrambling to figure out how to resolve the problem of Yakuza continually coming into their space and flaunting the rules and taking their money and figuring and devising different ways to get every little bit of extra coin that they can from these kind of really inept, or at least what they presented at the beginning, kind of inept staff members of the hotel.
Yeah, and they can't even get witnesses to testify on their behalf, right? Because when the police come, the hotel staff, they're like, oh, look, all of these people here saw it, and nobody says they saw anything, right? It's just more of what you're talking about, that whole idea of they just don't want to get involved at all with that. Another thing that stuck out to me is just like the portrayal of the Yakuza, right? It's so different from what we usually think of. Like the Yakuza, when you're looking at them, either in Japanese movies or in foreign movies, they're they're always portrayed as like like almost like a strong silent type, right?
Mm.
Or there's a lot of carryover from the samurai pictures of old, and the yakuza feel like they're like modern day samurai. That's how they try to look at themselves, and there have been a lot of yakuza organizations that have actually funded low budget yakuza movies in Japan, and they also try to push that whole image that we're an honorable organization, right? We're criminals, but we still have honor. We're still they've done stuff like, and there are instances where they have backed that up to some extent, like I think it was the Kobe earthquake, when they were able to dispatch emergency personnel and aid faster than the government was able to.
Right. Yeah. So you have those kinds of stories, that, in a very different vein in the film world, like thinking kind of nostalgically about the way the Godfather portrayed a mafia family, but they equally were like providing services to their community, things
right, and
that
there's
were.
the
Oh,
famous
go
scene
ahead.
when the famous scene of The Godfather reminded of. I just want to get this out before I forget it. When they're talking about the idea of getting into the drug trade, right?
Right.
And Don Corleone, Marlon Brando is just like, no, we're not gonna mess around with that, right? We deal with alcohol, we deal with women, we deal with gambling. Those are harmless crimes.
Right.
They're
Yeah.
not necessarily, but still.
Right. Well, it's all in whatever rules you create for your organization, and even that, even in the world of that film, they ultimately give in to selling drugs, through making an arrangement with the other family. So even these seemingly hard rules that they set for themselves can always be manipulated if there's enough money
Yeah.
involved. But what you were saying about the ability for the yakuza to provide services after the Kobe earthquake, that's definitely something that's shared pretty frequently of it's again another sign that there is too much red tape in government. I mean, if we look at Kurosawa's film from the 1950s, Ikiru, the
Right.
entire film is about a low level public office worker who's trying to cut through the red tape of society so a park can be built. It's sort of the sweetest version of like NBC's Parks and Recreation, where you have someone just trying their very best to do something they think would be good, but they're being stopped by all of the rules, regulations that have been established over time of how things get processed, how things get accomplished, and the yakuza are able to kind of cut right through that.
Yeah.
And so that's where you have a little bit of a glorification of them. But equally, if you look at the Ken Takakura films of the 1970s, the Toei Ninkyo Eiga, there are all of these depictions of they are somewhat stoic figures, and sort of a hyper sort of representation of masculinity, or a type of masculinity. But there's equally, if you think of the gangster films that are happening kind of parallel to Minbo no Onna that Kitano is making, like Boiling Point, or probably at this point, it would be a few years after, I think 94, when Sonatine is released. And I think about that as being equally having some humorous moments, but you'll still have these kind of Yakuza battles that are taking place, lots of gunplay and these sort of intense dramas. So there are these sort of patterns that we see Yakuza behaving as. So to have a picture like Minbo no Onna, I feel like really strips down some of the images that we have of these characters, because if we think of the opening of the film, so the opening of the film is at this pool in the hotel, and you have 4 or 5 yakuza with their Irezumi on full display. They're just going to go right into the pool. There's lots of close-up shots, so you see them sort of walking with active defiance, like they know that tattoos are not allowed in a pool area or a spa area. And we have the confrontation with the what seems to be a lobby person, and you have this sort of classic vision of what the yakuza are. So you open the film with seemingly this idea of what yakuza are, but the moment that Nobuko, or our character of Mahiru Inoue, steps into frame, you start to see that image get taken down a notch, and you start to see that they are a bit of sort of oafish people, because
Right.
she just leads them around with anything that she's saying, talking about, that this is a place that diplomats come, and, the vice president of the United States might be here, and any of these plainclothes people could be police officers. And,
Hmm.
it's aided by the fact that we had the shot earlier of, a woman reading a book in English, seemingly a foreigner, working on a
Hmm.
laptop. So it's creating this cosmopolitan atmosphere for this hotel, a suggestion, and the entire structure of the hotel looks to be sort of a faux European sort of glamorous hotel setting.
Right.
So it suggests that you're going to have a mix mash of people from Japan and people from other countries that would be staying at this place. And so equally, the people that are from Japan, there's an expectation of the type of food, the type of service that you would
Hmm.
receive in a hotel like this, as opposed to a ryokan or some other type of place that would have more traditional Japanese sort of inn features.
Right.
And I just love that very quickly we are given this idea of what you've seen with Yakuza all the way through, the most popular period of the 70s and 80s, and then with one quick dialogue, sort of monologue from Inoue, we are just sort of looking at oafish people for the rest of the film, because any
Yeah.
other any other sequence, they are almost just sort of screaming and spitting out every bit of dialogue. They're just sort of this. They're all color coded too. They each have their colors that they're wearing in their suits. So there's just this sort of stripping away of any sort of individuality or sense that these are people in control of anything, and really they're just sort of loud shouting buffoons.
Yes, yeah. I that there's also that one scene that especially illustrated that is there's a confrontation she has with the Yakuza guys behind the negotiating table, where the guy's shouting at her and saying, like, my men aren't afraid to go to prison. She's like, oh really? Well, why are you bringing that up? If you're telling me that they're afraid to go to prison, are you making a threat against me? He's like, no, I'm not saying that. I'm not. And she's like, well, maybe I should get your names. And she remains completely calm. Like, she never breaks at all when she's facing off with them. And and you can tell, like, when you're looking at the Yakuza and they're trying to intimidate her, the fact that she's not reacting in any way other than calm indifference to their threats, it just, they don't know what to do with that.
Right. I mean, and again, like, it can't be understated that you have a female character at the center of this. We are
Yes.
still, we still have really bad gender politics in Japan. That when I am teaching my class every year, as you revisit things that would be considered classic films, some of the boundaries of what women could or were able to
Hmm.
do within the representation of specific films, or the way in which society is depicted in an Ozu picture or a Kurosawa film, whether it's a present day picture, or a samurai film, or jidaigeki. You confront how limited some of these characters are. And one of the gifts, I think, that Itami does, is that it almost seems like a farce that you have a female character with as much control, composure, and agency that she does in all of the films, so that even if it wasn't something that would be relatable or actualized at the time, I think it can be a successful sort of push to say, like, all of these things are sort of artificial constructs of who should be in power, who should be in
Hmm.
control, and that with just the means and ability, any person can accomplish that. But within the context of this film, she is sort of seen, kind of in the way that, like, the manga Hataraki Man, sort of puts, like, this woman with the power of 2.5 men or 3 men. There's still sort of this idea that she is put on a pedestal by the very fact that she could
Hmm.
stand up to these yakuza, and the staff can kind of be enamored with her ability and her skill. But I think that if you look at all of Itami's films kind of in conjunction with one another, just the way that he looks at the person of his the reality of his wife, of Nobuko Miyamoto,
Hmm.
and the characters that she plays from Tampopo on, there's always like a little bit of her personality, along with this kind of fantastic version of a woman who's able to come in and really change things around. If you look at Supermarket Woman, or
Hmm.
woman in witness protection, and definitely Minbo no Onna, you
Right.
have this just, I feel like just a great representation of the possibility that society can have. That we might not be there right now, but we need to work towards removing some of these boundaries and barriers that we have.
Oh, absolutely. That was one of the things that I made a note of too. And I actually looked up the numbers for this when I taught this movie to my class last year. And so this is today, less than 20% of the lawyers in Japan are women. And the ones who actually are prominent enough and stand up to the Yakuza and take action against the Yakuza, like Inoue does in this movie, all of those are men. And and that's today in 2020. So you go back to
Right.
or 20, this episode might actually drop in 2021, but you go back to 1992, right? And you have to imagine just the numbers must have been even lower back then.
Yeah, and I was watching the making of the picture, and they interview probably three, four, five, attorneys that do Minbo work,
Mhm.
and yeah, all men and all very aged men too.
Yes. Yeah.
There was never a young person that was sort of fresh out of law school, that was new to the firm that they were interviewing. It was someone that was just looked like they were an aging yakuza boss themselves, and the way
Mhm.
that their hair was done and some of their mannerisms and things. It was kind of striking to me to see that there was definitely none of the boisterous behavior that you see of the yakuza in the film, but just in terms of what they saw as reality depicted in the film versus kind of some of the fantastical elements that are included in the picture. I think that they were still somewhat impressed by the choices that
Mhm.
Itami and his group made in terms of the schemes that are presented in the film, which after watching this film two or three times, I'm kind of struck. Like, how did you think of the individual schemes the Yakuza members came up with? Like, compared to other films, I was kind of surprised in some ways of some of the things we saw.
Okay. Well, let's touch on that. I'm curious what surprised you about some of the schemes.
Well, just sort of, when I think of a group that would be a criminal organization that is trying to, gain money, gain opportunity in any way they can, things like uh, putting the cockroach in the lasagna,
Mhm.
or leaving a bag and, needing someone to, pay up and return that sort of funds. It just felt very low level, felt very low stakes types and that's where I think the English title of adding the gentle art of extortion, which is not
Mhm.
part of the Japanese title, is to kind of, I think, give viewers outside of Japanese context a little bit of a sense of these are not high level crimes that you're trying to accomplish. They're trying to
Mhm.
just get a little penny at a time or a yen at a time from a hotel or a different organization, but it's still not presented in the same way that traditional mafia or even other yakuza films, where they're providing protection to that business.
Right. Right.
They so that was something that, like, I felt was like unique and nice to sort of see, which again I feel
Mhm.
connects back to kind of the oafish sort of behavior of it, that there may be people that represent this kind of criminal mastermind idea, but there's probably a lot of people that are much more like this, that just try to use a little bit of power, a little bit of control over someone that's a little bit weaker, through any kind of means necessary to get a little bit of money. But I was curious how specific schemes struck you, but the cockroach one definitely stands out really big to me, just because it
Mhm.
feels like such a very low level way to try to extort something out of a business or a restaurant.
It actually doesn't surprise me that they would resort to tax like that, because it's so low key that you know what are you going to do? You're going to go to the police and tell them the Yakuza are shaking me down because they put a cockroach in the lasagna, right?
Right.
It's such a low key thing that it's not like the Yakuza are asking for money or they'll break my windows, right?
Right.
That's a little bit more of a physical threat. The police can actually have some action against that. Whereas the Yakuza are putting insects in their own food. The police are going to be like, how are you going to prove that to me? Like that there's
Right.
so I think in one way it's kind of clever in that way, whereas going with these very small crimes, and especially with the whole Japanese concept of otome omotenashi, where it's all about providing like the best service and all that, and the hospital doesn't want to risk losing their reputation at all, and so those types of things that actually does make sense. Also, it goes to the pettiness of these criminals, and also I think I'm not really sure when the decline of the yakuza really started. It may have been in this time period, it may have been later, but if it was in this time period, that also helps to serve to illustrate just like how far they've fallen, right? They went from being these massive organizations with all this control and all these political connections to now, slipping cockroaches into their food to bilk a few, a few 10,000 yen notes off of the hotel. So another thing too is I have heard of stuff like this in real life too. I had a friend years ago when I first came to Japan who was extorted by some guys who, I don't think they were actually yakuza, but they tried to play themselves off as yakuza, and I can't remember the exact details, but he had met some girl or something at a bar, and they had a night together, and then she had asked for some money or something. He gave him some money, and the next day, she calls him up and she's like, "Oh, come on downstairs." Comes downstairs, and there are these two guys with her in the car, and they're like, "Get in the car." He gets in the car, and one of the guys is telling her, it's like, you need to give us, what she used that money for? And he's like, no. He's like, she used it for drugs. Like you gave her drug money. That's illegal. And it's like, you better, and unless you want us to go tell the police, you better give us all the money you can get out of your bank account right now. And they had tried to pull this scheme on him like a few times. And eventually he ended up getting a friend to help him out. The friend ended up working with the police, and they ended up catching the guys. And it turned out they had no affiliation with the yakuza. But it was just that kind of example of just like how they'll use like these strong arm tactics and like these implied threats, and just the mystique of the yakuza alone, they'll hold that over as a way to try and get what they want.
And that's really the early part of the film, the first 30, 40 minutes until the Inoue character really enters into the picture proper, where it really is showing that most of the actions and behaviors of the hotel members who don't want to see anything, don't want to talk, and more so the staff members who are quick to want to pay them off, is that mystique, the idea of the threat of what could happen, because you don't actually see any real violence or real repercussions take place as a result. It's all just through loud voices, language, and either direct or implied threats. And so, like you're saying, you use the fear of someone who's afraid of what could happen as the means by which to take whatever you can from them. So that's where I think that we are seeing this push back and forth in the film of how much is bluster and how much is there actually some repercussions or violence that can come as a result of these actions. And I think that if you look at other yakuza pictures of like I was saying, like Toei's sort of run through pictures, or the Fukasaku Kinji films of the battles without honor and humanity from the 1970s, that are taking more of a historical perspective on the sort of outgrowth of the yakuza. There you see a lot more violence. You see the finger cutting, you see the destruction, and it at least within those films, it sort of supports Inoue's notion that gangster members are mostly interested in fighting and killing each other to control things, and less about putting violence on others. But seeing that in representations in the media, and maybe having an interaction like what your friend described, those things can kind of put some real fear in the average person if they were to ever run up against someone.
That was one point that I like that they make in the movie, when she strips away a lot of what that mystique is, right? Because most of these guys, probably before the events of this movie, the only interaction they ever had with the yakuza was probably from movies and TV, and so they probably never had any interactions with them in real life. But and then they make that point where she says, you shouldn't be afraid of them because they'll attack each other, right? They'll kill each other, but they're not going to go after regular citizens, because then the law is going to come down on them hard. right?
Right.
But that if they're out killing each other, right, the cops don't really care. But if they're going to kill an ordinary citizen, then they're going to be in trouble and they're going to face prison. And one of the things she mentioned was, prison is very expensive for the yakuza. And just as a cultural note here for anyone who doesn't know much about the yakuza who's listening to this, the yakuza are because of that whole family aspect, that whole aspect of honor. The deal is that if a yakuza guy goes to prison, the gang has to keep paying for his family's expenses, right? They have to keep paying the salary and all that. So, the yakuza doesn't want to do that. They don't want to, especially now with as they've declined in notoriety and power. So they don't want to have to spend that amount of money to fulfill their obligation. So that's one of the reasons why they'll just use, like, they'll talk big and they'll threaten, but they won't actually act on those threats.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the idea of the Yakuza families dwindling, I think, is also an interesting note in this, because it makes you, think as to how much had they really dwindled since the heyday of the post-war period, where the black market was a really important part of the reconstruction of Japan, into the all the way through the Tokyo Olympics, to the bursting of the bubble, which we're kind of right at. And that's another thing of watching this picture, where this is released in the spring of '92, the same year that there's tons of news articles and reporting on the fact that Japan's economic miracle had finally burst.
Right.
It had finally run out of gas. And in some ways, watching this film, you sort of feel that floundering of the Yakuza, just trying to maintain their importance, maintain their grip on society, the hold that they have, either through different kinds of construction jobs, like we see a little portion of in this picture, or these, mundane, small schemes to, just eke out a few $1,000s. Really suggests like a society on decline, a group that's, about to sort of fall apart. And that's where, like, I haven't read extensively, but I have read some of Jake Adelstein's work, and he's focused a lot on the Yakuza in his reporting for the Japan Times and other publications through his career. And
I think it was
definitely
Yomiuri Shimbun, actually.
Well, that was where he was initially at, but he's also published more recently in Western magazines, but also Japan Times. But yeah, he was with Yomiuri, and I think there was a period of time where he either was with Asahi or was sort of like battling with them, the sort of infighting that happens between papers. But yeah, he's made a career of sort of talking about the Yakuza and looking at sort of their decline, in recent years.
Just a few notes about Jake Adelstein, because the guy's an amazing writer. I just wanted to make sure people know where they can find his stuff. So a lot of what Patrick's talking about, especially his extensive experiences with the Yakuza, he wrote a book called Tokyo Vice, which I definitely recommend everybody read. It's an amazing read. And it's being turned into a TV series as well. I think on HBO Max, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But yeah, that's it was slowed down obviously because of COVID, but that's definitely a book you'll want to check out. And he also has a website. I think it's Japan Subculture, which he does a lot of writing for, and has a lot of other people writing for that. Also, he's got stuff in the Daily Beast, and I referenced him extensively, especially when I did the episode on shoplifters, because he wrote a great article about kind of the conservative government response to that movie and how they try to portray it as a pro-crime movie because
right, yeah.
Ending.
Well, I mean, he's of course been critical of Abe's leadership, and I imagine that will continue with our new prime minister. But you have him always kind of trying to look in the cracks and the corners of things that are useful in reporting on Japan, but also on a headline level are relatively enticing for Western eyes too. He writes about the Yakuza, he writes about sex scandals in the idol world. You have all of these different things that fit into the kind of reporting that a film like Minbo no Onna fits sort of right into the world of what he was living through and dealing with in the 1990s. So I'd be curious. I don't know specifically if he wrote about this film, but I'd be curious what his thoughts were on a picture like this.
Well, he and I actually know him, so I should probably talk to him about coming on the show at some point. But he did. I know he talked about Itami a few times because one of the things he mentions in his book is that he had heard from his yakuza sources that Itami's apparent suicide was actually not a suicide at all. It was actually the yakuza retaliation for not only this film, but also he was working on another film, or he planned to work on another film. I'm trying to double check here. But yeah, Itami had wanted to do another movie, and I think this was going to be yeah, so a former member of the Gotogumi faction told Adelstein in 2008, "We set it up to stage his murder as a suicide. We dragged him up to the rooftop and put a gun in his face. We gave him a choice: jump and you might live, or stay and we'll blow your face off. He jumped, he didn't live." And he had been falsely accused of an affair, which is also believed that the affair was also a result of the yakuza too, whether or not it was actually real. And he had planned to do a movie. He wanted to expose some sort of connections between the yakuza and I gotta double check this because I have it written down right here. Here we go. Yeah, so we're going to expose the Gotogumi's relationship with Soka Gakkai, which is a very influential cult, basically.
Yeah, and the manner in which they sort of tried to extort him in those, if we're following Adelstein's writing, and we're following sort of the truth of that writing, then this idea of him having an affair is also sort of trumped up, but it's also put in with the gossip magazines and the media sort of the day. And so if you're looking at the reporting of that coming out, there was this idea that somehow this potential affair would cause him to jump from the ceiling of his office, which for his family members seemed like sort of an absurd thing, even if he had been caught in an affair. So there's just lots of things that continue to put doubt. And then with the more recent reporting by Adelstein, really suggesting that we're seeing the upshot from what had occurred post this film of a week after the film was released in May of '92, that he's in an alleyway, and a car pulls up and is stabbing and slashing him with a knife, and he's having to be rushed to the hospital. So I don't know if you've seen some of the news footage around that time, but they have tens of cameras around him as he's actually being led into the hospital on a gurney, and they're having to actually shove the reporters out of the way as he's being put into the hospital. And you have Miyamoto tearfully responding to a press conference. And so the nature of this story just sort of literally fell into real life in the week after the film was released. And there's this sort of push and pull between the fiction of the film and the reality that comes right to them, because the Gotogumi was also accused of being responsible for the initial attack on Itami. So in particular, this family really was displeased with the choices Itami was making in his career, and the ways that he was depicting the yakuza. And it equally, I feel like if you go back and look at the news reporting at the time, further exposes stuff that everyone is very familiar with, of the exploitation by sort of media news culture of events like this. You have this really dramatic music of basically the same footage, the same 4 or 5 seconds of Itami being ushered into the hospital, as if this is like some high stakes drama rather than just a human being who has suffered a violent attack. There's no sense of there being any kind of reality to this. It's all, what artifice can we create around this, of this violent attack, and what little morsels of news can we get either from the grieving wife, or from his co-workers at his office, or the hospital staff, or the police officers that were on the scene. Even coming several days later and doing close-ups of blood splatters that they were finding on the road and on the different guardrails and things. So it's a little bit disgusting to sort of see the way that news media was sort of portraying this event, but it's very in keeping with other representations that you see at the time of, there's even some films, I am escaping the name right now, where they're depicting, media news members actually watching people being killed on live cameras, because there had been an incident like that in, I want to say, the late 80s or early 90s, where you have this just sort of really ravenous kind of not mainstream newspapers, but kind of lower level weekly magazines that are just trying to have any kind of scandalous bit about whatever sex scandal we can publish about, or any kind of violent act that we can kind of connect. And this just sort of feels in keeping with that, and it adds another layer to the importance of a picture like this, is that sometimes the ways in which we are satirizing society can have some real negative real life repercussions.
Yeah, that actually reminded me of, we were talking briefly about One Missed Call before we started up here, and it reminded me of that situation when the TV producer goes to the girl who's gotten the phone call, and their whole thing is they want to put it on TV, and they want to broadcast even when she's clearly being attacked by something. He's still like, no, keep the cameras rolling.
Right. Yeah, there's some type of benefit to be gained from like always filming, and that's only continued to grow over time, the importance of always having a camera on, or recording every kind of event in life, however mundane it might seem, that you might be able to get some exposure, or get some kind of popularity out of it. Go ahead.
I was just going to mention too the fact that Suzuki is an accountant and Wakasugi is a former wrestler. I thought it was interesting that he chose those two jobs for those two characters, because those are kind of like the two areas where the yakuza really operate, right? Where they operate in the financial industry. They would buy up some stocks, and then they would go to the board meetings, and they would start intimidating the board. They would start causing trouble as a way to try to, kind of what they're doing to the hotel too. So there's the financial stuff they're into, and real estate and all that kind of thing. But also there's the not only violence, but also just their involvement in sporting events and like fixing sumo matches and things like that. So I just thought it was kind of an interesting contrast to have both those two be the main characters that are afraid to stand up to them.
And equally, what you would think of as the money and the brute force, if we're going to sort of boil it down to that they are both ineffectual, that neither of those things is able to accomplish the job initially. So it has that duality of referencing the real world entanglements of the yakuza, but equally just on a narrative character level, you have seemingly someone that should have an understanding of the resources of the hotel financially and how they can use that, and then on another end, someone who literally can push and thrust someone out of a space, neither one being able to accomplish that.
Also
because
on
again,
sorry, go ahead.
Just that mystique that we were talking about of the yakuza, just having a sense of control over them.
Also, I thought it was on the gender equality aspect of it too, because here you've got money and you've got physical power, right? These two images of masculine power in a modern society, where you've got the guy, the big strong guy, and then you got the money guy, and neither of those forces either, those forces that are usually associated with masculinity, are able to do the job as well. So there's that aspect too from the gender equality, where you have to have a woman come in to stand up to them and sort of like slap them on the wrist and tell them to cut it out.
Well, and even more so that this idea that by the nature of their gender, men would have an awareness of how to accomplish a situation. It doesn't necessarily mean that, Inoue needs to be, someone 3 times as intelligent. You just need someone with competency. And in this case, we actually have a competent person who happens to be female that's able to do this and able to, because at no point you see her using her gender in traditional ways of something related to sexuality or some kind of bodily control. It's all related to her awareness of the law, her own personal sort of history with the yakuza and her family that kind of drives her for her profession. That again, I feel like is another, it's not like some huge step forward, and this is not some amazing feminist picture, but just having a space where you're focusing on the the job of a person, and you're not focusing on her love interest or her need to be with a man to accomplish the goal of the film. You know, there's no sort of sense of her needing to have any kind of other person help her out to accomplish her goal. And you even have that dialogue in there that, you know, she lives alone, you know, and that it's, and she's, you know, by herself, that, you know, it's dangerous for a woman to live alone. And she just sort of brushes that off. It's like it has no real weight in her you know, construction as a person or a character in the film.
Well, something too about that is the fact that she's also a middle-aged woman. I thought was an interesting aspect. I mean, you know, in one way you could read that as the fact that she's Itami's wife, so that's why he put his wife in the movie. But it is an interesting aspect of the film to have a middle-aged woman be the one who takes control of this, because you know, it's been famously talked about that if you're in film, right, you've either got to be a young woman and you've got to be playing like, you know, one of those roles, or you've got to be an older woman and you've got to be like kind of like the mentor role or something like that. And whereas you've got this big gap in between where middle-aged women are just kind of ignored. So
or they're just mothers, you know, being in the home. Yeah, exactly. Working in a service role. Yep.
Right. But so for her having such a prominent role and being like this, really the source of all the power in this movie, I thought was a really good choice.
Yeah, and even like when we were introduced to her, you know, like we were mentioning in the pool sequence, you know, she's laying out, you know, almost like you'd be sunbathing, but rather than it be some kind of glamour shot or something, you know, that would inherently suggest sexuality, you have this close up of her face that she's got these tissues stuffed over her nose, you know, so there's already kind of just a slight visual comedic element to her appearance that, you know, if you just even take that tissue away, you know, you don't get that extra little bit of an effect. Like, you know, I've always kind of wondered sort of how and why that was, whether it was, you know, a concern about sunbathing or not. And really, you know, and the making of, they're talking in explicit terms that like you don't see women in a shot like this where they aren't made to look glamorous, where they aren't made to look like they're perfect. So just by having a person that is really, like, I think a closer approximation of maybe someone that would really exist in real life, of, you know, just not really having everything completely together visually to, you know, sort of be this stunning beauty, is just a nice little element. You know, it's belied a little bit by, of course, the, you know, the makeup and the costuming and the hairdo that's done for a film, but it's still a little touch that gets you out of the realm of we are sexualizing this character. You know, you are focused on her for her, you know, what we find out at the end of that scene of what her job is and the skill set that she has, far less than anything that's sort of related to a superficiality about you know, this Inoue character.
Well, the comedic element you mentioned made me think of something too, and the fact how it kind of sets your expectations when you see her, right? You see her and you think, oh, there's this funny looking woman with these tissues stuffed up her nose, and then she turns around and, you know, she's a total badass, basically.
Right. So much so that they, you know, they think she might be the wife of a yakuza boss. You know,
right,
she's been
exactly.
able to understand the dialogue and is very able to sort of work within the bounds of these characters without even actually revealing anything about herself. Is able to get them to change their behavior, and you know, we go from there. And it's a nice, you know, focusing on this opening sequence is great because it also sort of, it reminds me how much work that first sequence has to do, because she doesn't return to the film for another 40 minutes.
Right.
So you know, in a 2-hour runtime picture, you know, you only have about, you know, an hour and a half where Inoue is in some way kind of connected with the narrative of the film. So there's a lot of work that has to be done by these other staff members, the yakuza, to sort of set up the problems and the challenges that are faced before Inoue can come in and you know, really change the dynamic that we are sort of establishing throughout the early film. So that early pool sequence has to do a lot of work for us to keep her in our mind, to think about how successful and effective she is, so that when these staff members are bumbling through everything and the yakuza are kind of just running roughshod over them, that we know that there's, you know, potentially this you know, this escape or this, you know, competent person that can come in and change things. But there's a lot of time that goes in between that opening sequence and her appearing underneath the table in the banquets sort of scene, which I love. I think it's just, again, it's a great way to introduce the character. She comes in the narrative. It's not like she's bursting through double doors and she's gonna solve it. It's like she's literally climbing underneath this banquet table, and like, oh, it's cozy in here, I'm gonna take a nap. Like, just I love all those little touches that they don't mean anything in the push of the narrative and what the characters mean or what they say, but it's those little touches that stick in my mind as I think back on the movie, of like how you introduce a character, how you present them, what things can give you just a little thing that you remember them a bit more, So I love all those little touches of Itami's films, whether you're watching it in Tampopo with the way that they, deal with food culture, or, something, like, the Taxing Woman Returns, which deals a bit with the fraud that was taking place with these new religions that were happening a lot in the late 80s and early 90s. He's just got all these little observations that add on to a much sort of larger picture. And so one thing that I made in my notes was like, even thinking how it's a very small part, but when we get towards the end of the film and the yakuza are sort of chasing the staff members around, they run into a wedding and knock over that big gigantic fake cake that certain couples that have a Western style wedding will do, where you're paying thousands of dollars to stand next to a gigantic fake cake that it looks just sort of absolutely insane. And I just love that it's not commenting on whether it's a good or bad thing, but just sort of showing like these are all these little things that we do in life, all these expectations that we're supposed to have. Like if you get married, you're expected to do certain types of things at your wedding, or have a certain type of wedding. And it would take place at a hotel like this so that you can have all the ambiance and you can have all these little elements that are involved in it. And I just always, it's like I said, light humor. There's always just a little chuckle that I'm having as I'm watching his films.
Yeah. Something else too is in this is something Itami had said. He said that Japanese men have 4 great weaknesses. They can't stand loneliness, they can't make decisions alone, can't face anyone who disagrees with them, and can't accept responsibility for their mistakes, and also that they can't laugh at themselves. And I thought that was kind of an interesting quote to look at with this movie, because you see a lot of those qualities in all the male characters throughout the movie.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I'm curious, like which character do you think maybe best represents that, or represents one of the facets for you, in terms of like?
Well, I think both Suzuki and Wakasugi definitely represent that, because especially they can't make decisions by themselves and they can't face being alone. Because I think that
right.
I think those two definitely apply to them. Can't face anyone who disagrees with them and can't accept responsibility. I think that really applies to kind of not only the yakuza but also the hotel management. I think there's a lot going on with them, and they can't laugh at themselves. That definitely applies to the yakuza characters, because they're, like you said, they're so oafish in this movie, and they never really realize how ridiculous they're coming across.
Yeah, it's the behavior is sort of the inverse. They feel they're presented as speaking very seriously and with great intensity, but by the very nature of that intensity and the almost sort of rigid robotic way that they're going about these schemes of like what they need out of the staff members, that the comedy just kind of keeps sort of building up, because they are so controlled by their own expectation of what they represent as yakuza figures, or how they're being portrayed in the film. Like I said, like the costuming alone does a lot of work, where you have one family in all red suits or a type of red hue, and equally a group in purple or the group in black. You have very signified color coding for each of them, so that once again they are not individuals. We don't really know them as human beings. They are just part of this clan, this gaggle of people that are just making sort of loud noise. Like, again, whether or can speak Japanese or not, the type of Japanese that yakuza members speak and are portrayed in this film, not necessarily a representation of real life, but within the world of this film, is just the roughest, hard. the language itself to me is absurd, because I've seen a good number of Yakuza films, and there is an element to the speech pattern in this film that's represented in those, but I feel like it's been dialed up three or four levels to sort of present the absurdity of the way in which masculinity is sort of structured in this group, or the way that Yakuza are supposed to present themselves to the world, that, again, just seems like a lot of spitting and a lot of frustration, and really never any moment where they seem like compassionate human beings. So again, that's where, like, when there's real violence sort of enacted upon Itami, I can understand it from just a basic sense of not being able to take any kind of criticism or have any sort of internal humor. I mean, that to me, that's sort of the ultimate success of the film, as unfortunate as it is, that this violence that was enacted upon Itami and his family is really an outgrowth of just how well he's able to show the weakness of what the Yakuza are.
Right.
And how they think of themselves, and how they think of themselves in society, and their importance in society, or at least the importance they build up for themselves. So that's why when I think of like Kitano's trilogy of the past decade of the Outrage series, that just seems like that other end of it, like removing the humor. So all you have is sort of the utmost version of like the most serious, most dour Yakuza figures that you can put into a film, which equally, if you were to do like a double feature with Minbo no Onna, I think would still reveal, just like in a little way, in a small way, how Kitano can still kind of make fun of this group by presenting it almost as the most serious thing in the world. That they are just the most solemn, not necessarily stoic, but just self-important people that you can put into a picture.
Yes, yeah. Something else that also stood out to me was the black vans that they use. The
right.
That, because so for anyone who doesn't know, there are a lot of far right groups in Japan called Uyoku Dante, and is Dante? Yeah, Uyoku Dantai, and these are far right groups. There's some that are anti-American, some that are just anti-Korean and anti-Chinese. Basically, all of them agree that World War II was a smear campaign against the Japanese Empire, and they deny war crimes and all sorts of stuff. And just a bunch of far right nutcases, basically. And but one of the things they do is they drive around in these big black vans that are covered with imperial Japanese slogans. They have like the rising sun flag on it and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things these vans are outfitted with loudspeakers, and they're always broadcasting basically messages of hate whenever they drive through. Actually, ironically enough, the first time I saw one was when I was on a date with a Japanese woman, and we were just sitting in the car, and this black van drives by, and I look at her and I'm just like, "Were those the?" And she's like, "Yeah," and she's just like really ashamed.
Well, I mean, for me, it was sort of like almost a wake up siren on Saturdays and Sundays. Like I lived in Ryogoku for a time, which has one of the main venues for sumo matches in the wintertime. And so we always, like, on the highway would have those loudspeaker black vans driving by, sending out their message, which, on a highway, when you're hearing that there's so much distortion, it's much more difficult to sort of make out the specific things they're saying. But if you go to Shibuya or some of the other major metropolitan areas where they're sort of camped out and they actually are stopping, then you kind of can hear the patter of what they're doing a bit more. So it was interesting to see the utilization of that iconography for the means of the Yakuza members to try to again suggest that there was some ill behavior by the hotel members, like again, all a farce, but using these mechanisms in society that people are familiar with these trucks, and it's maybe a negative element, but they're always sort of there. Again, like I was saying, in a way like the wedding cake, where it's something that appears in the film, and you have these black trucks in the film, and there's a specific purpose of what they're doing, but and you could touch on the subjects we're talking about, but it's not inherent in the narrative. You know, they're not talking about far right groups in the narrative of the film, but everyone is very familiar with what these trucks look like and what they
Right.
represent and what they do. But it has no relation or bearing on the specific things that they are saying in the dialogue of the film. So I love that we have these, again, these small touches that Itami is putting into the film that are visually, right there. We have multiple scenes with the vans in there, but they're not talked about in a way where we are seriously sort of diving into the ramifications of what these right-wing groups are doing in society, or how this film is making a judgment on them. It's up really for the audience to kind of see them, but inherently, by putting the Yakuza members in it, again, is revealing sort of the buffoonish behavior of these trucks. I mean, the trucks themselves in the film look like a sort of a heightened version of what you see on the street, because a lot of times the vans that you'll see on the street are quite a bit smaller than what we have in this film. There's any number of different models that are used to strap a loudspeaker to, but there's sort of an imposing visual sense to the trucks in the film, but again is undercut by just the buffoonery of the Yakuza.
Yeah, and one of the things that people may not be realize is that because freedom of ideology is protected under the Japanese Constitution, arresting these members is very difficult unless they actually do commit violent acts. And the Yakuza use a lot of these groups as camouflage. There are a number of groups that have affiliations with Yakuza syndicates. So one is a Nihon Seinensha, which is the Japan Youth Society, Nihon Kominto, the Japan Emperor's People's Party, Taikosha, Great Enterprise Society, Sekijuku, Sane Thinkers School, and Yukoku Doshikai. So all of these are some of the groups that are known to have affiliations with Yakuza groups, and it's bold of, I think it's kind of bold of Itami to draw that use that visual and say, basically state in no uncertain terms that the Yakuza are working together with these groups, which no doubt pissed off a lot of people, I'd imagine.
Right, and I think that's again a wonderful thing about how his comedies function, and is a reflection of sort of the outgrowth of the type of people that he was working with. I mean, he comes from the filmmakers of Oshima and Yoshida Kiju of the 1960s. He made a short film when he was a student called Rubber Band Pistol that kind of in some ways is humorous, but also is dealing with student life at the time, which in the 60s had a lot of protesting against the renewal of the Security Treaty of Japan in both 1960 and 1968, when the renewal for the treaty was coming up. So he, as just a human being in his lived experience, is kind of coming out of these pushing back against what they saw as authoritarian groups, or people that were imposing societal sort of will on average everyday people. And I feel that antagonism in pretty much every one of his films. The Funeral is dealing with a family trying to figure out, how do we actually put on a formal funeral ceremony when we're just the everyday regular people that don't think about these kind of things, and we don't have a great attachment to what we think of as Japanese tradition or behaviors that are expected of us. So they have to do all of these different ways of teaching themselves how to sort of fit into it, but by doing that they equally reveal just how difficult it is to do something you don't have an interest in. And then we move on to Taxing Woman, Tampopo, the A Quiet Life, The Last Dance. All of these films are in some ways, even if they have a sweet humorous tone to them, are all like dealing with the struggles that people face when they are dealing with something that's challenging in their life. That there's a lot of hardship of just moving through everyday life, and he does it with a lot of easy sort of digestible dialogue and humorous moments. And it reminded me of how like his film style is really understated. You're not really looking at flashy camera work, you're not having a lot of intense quick edits or montage or cross-cutting. You really are shooting it in a way that's much more like a sort of drama or sitcom, kind of a combination of those two, where you have a very clear sense of the geography of the space that you're in, and you have a very clear sense of where the characters are and how they move through the frame, so that you're not really focusing on his film style, and you're much more focused on the dialogue. So you have to make a connection with those characters. So those characters have to be saying something important or saying something that has some meaning for you. And in the case of Minbo no Onna, I feel like you have a combination of some serious dialogue from the Inoue character, along with some of her biting wit, along with this sort of slapstick that you have with the yakuza, that creates this really nice balance between a drama and a comedy. The classic dramedy idea that, while Tampo and some of the other films that Itami's made get a lot more attention, I think Minbo no Onna is just a really great example of the type of film that Itami was able to make in his kind of unfortunately shorter directorial career.
It's because looking over at some of these films he's made, and I've only seen Tampopo in this one, but like you mentioned, like The Funeral, A Taxing Woman, Daibyonin, which was about the Japanese medical institution, Supermarket Woman. The fact that he was planning to make this movie about the Goto's connections to the Soka Gakkai, I think he was definitely one of these directors who, like Fukasaku, like to a lesser extent now Koreeda, who wasn't afraid to really shine a very harsh light on Japanese society. And it's a real shame that we didn't get to see that, he didn't survive, and to get to see what movies he would have made in the current climate, because I think he would have definitely had a lot of interesting things to say about what's been happening in Japan in the past 20 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be exceptional if he had been able to have a career long enough where he could more directly kind of skewer the LDP, or just the upper lower house sort of machinations of government. I don't know if that would ever be a topic that he's actually interested in, since he usually used a family member or an individual in a system to sort of be the conduit for it. So I could very easily see him doing a fictionalized version of the Soda Kazuo documentary election or campaign from 2007, where you're looking at just sort of like a low-level election in that case in Kawasaki City, of just sort of the absurdity of what the LDP expects out of a candidate that they've kind of given their okay to, or suggested to run for a specific seat. That documentary does a lot of great work, but I would really love to have seen.
Sorry, what was the name of that documentary again?
I believe the English title is Campaign. The Japanese title is Senkyo, and I think it was released in 2007, 2008. And then Soda Kazuo has made upwards of 10 documentaries at this point, and he's had a lot of success in international festivals, both documentary focused and traditional festivals. His first really sort of splash was Campaign, because he was a friend or an associate of the subject of that documentary, which is part of why he kind of had access to this. And he's gone on to do things that look at sort of mental health in Japan, which throughout history, anyone that really didn't fit kind of a traditional mold, if you had a physical or mental disability, sometimes could be kind of ostracized by society, and really could only rely maybe on your family members if they didn't look down on you. For as much as there are social services and safety nets that exist in Japan, there's a lot of societal sort of struggles, and his film Mental did a great job of kind of looking at a few people that are just sort of trying to live their life, but deal with the challenges that presents. So, and then he's done he's very focused on observational, fly on the wall sort of cinema verite style, and he's done several on fishing villages in remote parts of Japan that by just the title suggest a very slow picture. But like anything, if you can get into the rhythm of the film, there's a lot of really great rewards of watching his films that connect him to a very nice tradition of documentary film in Japan, but things like Frederick Wiseman would be a good kind of Western connection to the type of films that Soda makes. And he's really prolific. He's made about 1 or 2 documentaries every year for the past 5-6 years. He had a residency at the University of Michigan for a year and did a documentary on sort of like a football game or an opening match that he did in collaboration with students in like a capstone course. So he's really open to a lot of different ways of filmmaking, but not in a documentary sense. I feel like he and Itami could have a lot to communicate about, because his films don't present an inherent political bias by watching them, but just by the nature of documentary form, you are perceiving this edited together presentation of a type of life, a type of existence, and it's hard not to empathize with the subjects that are in that film, and then to rethink how you have been behaving in your own life towards the people that are represented in this subject, because you're looking at people oftentimes that don't fit the main ideas of what people should strive for in their lives, or what they should achieve, or by no fault of their own deal with hurdles or challenges that no one could be expected to overcome, and yet they still are on a mass societal level. You're just expected to grit and bear it and deal with it and gaman shinai, and just keep working at it. So I really think that there's a lot, like any tragedy with the loss of Itami, we just missed out on a lot of other great pictures, or even if he doesn't make some masterpiece later on that doesn't exist, the ability for him to talk about his career or reflect on it, or to be able to have retrospectives where we can hear him kind of give some insight to what he was thinking about when he was making the films. It's just a real sad loss, but it's so fortunate that we have access to his films, and that I feel like more people should, now that there's a means to stream a lot of his films outside of Japan, that people should take advantage of seeing the kind of pleasure that each of these films bring. Depending upon, like I said, what point of time in your life you're in, I think there's a slice of life film that you'll gravitate to in his filmography.
And thank you for pointing out Soda to me. I've never heard of this filmmaker before, but just looking at his website and just hearing what you said about some of his films, I'm definitely gonna have to check out some of his work. Definitely seems right up my alley.
Yeah. I mean, I enjoy showing his films when I can in any survey course that I offer, or if there's an opportunity to focus on a documentary film specifically. I love being able to show his films, but again, in this world that we exist in, his films are not as readily available on a streaming service, so you have to buy from his website or through his Vimeo page, which I've done in the past. But I can't expect to have my students spend money for each of the films to watch and stream. So that again kind of comes back to, what are the things that streaming services have available to us? And like I was mentioning, you have the classics of Kurosawa and Ozu and Mizoguchi on a lot of these services, but someone like Itami kind of is sort of in the middle. You might be able to find his films, but other times they wouldn't have ever been streamable. Like you were mentioning, we've never had like a DVD release of English subtitles in the States for his films, so you only had like an old VHS copy you could find. So the streaming services are this sort of gift and curse. You have access, but you never have the ability to know if it's going to be there in a few months or a year from now. You have to just sort of hopefully get access when you can, watch it when you can, and just share this type of picture with more people, so that they'll maybe move beyond their natural sort of sit down on the couch and watch where you're turn your brain off type of film. Because I think there's still, like, you're not having to work too hard to enjoy these narratives, but it's still something like you have to pay a little bit of attention to get some of the smaller details.
Yeah, it's amazing, because there was this, it seems like these days the only Japanese movies you really have easy access to are like the classics, that Criterion Collection, and their credit, they put out a lot of really awesome products. But and then you get some, the manga and anime is easily available and all that. But and some of the more extreme stuff, like the kind of grindhouse style stuff that Takashi Miike and those kinds of guys do, or the horror stuff. But there's like this whole universe of movies that just kind of gets you occasionally you might get something. Like there was the brief period when I got into Japanese film in the early 2000s, when there were a lot of like Viz Media and other and Tartan, they were putting out a bunch of different movies out on DVD. So that's how that's how I ended up seeing like Train Man, Linda Linda Linda, and uh, Kamikaze Girls, and all these other types of movies. These, you know, these very kind of like, some of them are slice of life, but some of them are just kind of like, you know, they're not these like big genre set pieces, or they're not like the old classics. And also like Itami's films like Minbo or Tampopo or any of these other ones, where they're just not doing that anymore. It doesn't seem like there's anyone who's really doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few vendors in the UK. I think of like the Arrow Films, Arrow Film Academy, or Third Window Films, and occasionally you'll have a US distributor like the I think you've talked about in the past. One Cut of the Dead had a release in the UK, but also had a US release. So it is. I would agree. There's a more of a limit of the type of films that are being shown. But then, you know, in the States at least, there are a lot of films like the type that you're mentioning that appear on Amazon Prime's video service, or Netflix will have either their original content that they're putting out, because there is a Netflix Japan that is producing a lot of original films, and they're localizing it so that, you know, basically anyone with a Netflix account around the world can watch these both movies and television shows.
That's true, right? Because Shion Sono, a lot of his movies are coming out through Netflix as well, and they've got the Naked Director TV series, and then the Ju-on TV series. Those are both through Netflix as well. So yeah, that's very true as well.
So it's like, again, it's this gift and curse of like, there is access to things, but at the same time, there's a wall to it. You have to have a subscription to a specific service to just be able to license it, but you won't have a copy for yourself. So you wouldn't be able to necessarily directly share it with a friend right away, or, you know, there's a VPN limitation based on a geographical sort of limitation. So there's lots of things that, like, again, you know, as much as we move forward with technology, there's things that pull us right back. So, you know, in the case of the classics, there's a lot of access to those because there's been enough distribution around the world to, you know, be able to find them. But it also cultivates an idea of what Japanese cinema is for the masses, you know, in a very different way than what, you know, Tartan and these others did with the idea of J-horror or Asian extreme in the early 2000s. They're still kind of sculpting and creating an idea of what Japanese cinema is. And that's what, again, makes it difficult for a lot of reasons: language acquisition, just licensing of titles, to really be able to see a spectrum of movies that exist. Because as much as, you know, we've been talking about Itami Juzo films, they're not every type of film that's being released. You know, it was interesting because Minbo no Onna was the 5th highest grossing film of 1992, but it was, you know, it was below Porco Rosso, the Ghibli picture, and two Draimon films, but you also had, you know, pictures like the long-running Torasan series, you know, still kind of making a decent amount of money for Shochiku, being in the top 10. But it's also released at the same time that you have something like the sequel to Tetsuo, the Body Hammer, I think was the subtitle for that one. And then it's also at the same time that the rise of V cinema is really sort of in a stronghold. So, you know, we think of something like the King of Minami series that also had just, you know, tens and tens and tens of releases, you know, that you could put out very cheaply, but present like just a quick way that, you know, you could do a rental at, you know, whether it's Staya or your different local rental house. You could just pick up one of these cheap V cinema films and pop it in at the same time that you have these more traditional theatrical releases of something like Minbo no Onna. So like just the timing and the space that this film appears, I think also presents a nice facet into the type of hopes that the industry was having for how they could kind of keep themselves afloat during, again, a very sort of nebulous economic time as the bubble's bursting, and people are kind of scrambling to figure out how they're going to be able to survive this next sort of downturn economically, you know, as we go into, you know, what is thought of as the lost decade for Japan.
lost decades now.
Right, yeah, exactly. Continues on and on. But yeah, but no, I that's most of the notes that I had for the film. It's just been a pleasure being able to talk about Itami, because he, again, is someone that is known and was very popular at the time of the release of his films. But I think that there's still, with every generation, it's useful to you know, provide another light, another lens to these filmmakers that I think can still teach us things about society today, even if the films are now, you know, 20, 30 years old.
Absolutely. And well, that's one of the bad things about Japanese society is things change so slowly here. But one of the good things is a lot of these movies are still very relevant. Like I taught, you know, I taught Train Man, Densho Toko. When I teach that in my class, you know, most of my students, they either were you know, toddlers when it came out, or they weren't even born yet. And a lot of the themes in that movie are still relevant today, even more relevant in some cases.
Well, I mean, there's the specifics of the, you know, the way, you know, like the way like train culture you know, functions, or the way the technology worked at the time for the coupling to take place in that story in particular. But you know, in the case of Minbo no Onna, we're just dealing with power. You know, you know, the dynamics of who has it, who controls it, and how do you, you know, skirt around the laws and the rules of society. That's something that in any permutation of society, you're going to see that type of dynamic exist. The specifics of it could change, and it may even still be very much representative of what people do today. Because again, 30 years in terms of like legal changes and societal changes still could be, you know, kind of a short period of time. But I think that the heart of Itami's films are things that are like core human behaviors, you know, and it's filtered through all of these different little add-ons and things that could be specific to early 90s culture, or you know, Japan for, you know, a period of time. But at the heart, there's always something that's about just human behavior, how humans react to other humans, and what our fears are, what our hopes are. And it's kind of, that it sounds kind of lofty, but I think that that's one of those reasons why a picture like Densho Toko, you know, dealing with the coupling of a person who's a little bit nebbish with someone that seems like they're out of his league, you know, is still really appealing, because that's a theme that I think exists for a lot of people. I think most people, whether you're male or female, has a moment in your life where you don't necessarily feel completely sure of yourself, or have utmost confidence in your ability to, whether it's through a romantic relationship or through your professional development. There's always those things that appear. So even if you go 20, 30 years on, we might look at the telephones or the cell phones or the technology they're using as like a little bit dated, but the behavior is probably very, very similar.
Yeah. So I'm just looking up on the Criterion collection. So yeah, Minbo is available on there. It still looks like.
Yep.
Title is it's they don't use the Minbo title though. They use the rough English translation of The Gentle Art of Japanese Extortion. So if you're looking for Minbo, which I just tried to do on there, it won't show up. You have to search for The Gentle Art of Japanese Extortion, or just search for Itami.
Right.
And it looks like they got a lot of his stuff on there. They got A Quiet Life on there. They've got Taxing Woman, Rubber Band Pistol, which was his first movie, was a short. They've got The Funeral, Woman in Witness Protection, The Last Dance. So yeah, all his stuff they've got on there, it looks like.
Yeah. I think just about every one of his films is on there. Like I said, they even have his short film, Rubber Band Pistol, which is you know, again, it's something made much earlier in the 1960s, but it's still like is a nice little window into you know, his growth as a person and the types of films that, you know, he would go on to make. So yeah, I think any of the pictures that are available either through a streaming service or otherwise are useful to check out, just to kind of get a sense of his film style, the types of things they looked at. I think the only one you're missing out on is Dai Byoin, The Last Dance.
No, that is on there too.
Oh, it is? Okay, because
yeah,
when I was searching earlier, it wasn't accessible. So that's great. So that means that, yeah, you can really look at any one of his films, and like you were mentioning, you know, you hadn't checked out The Funeral yet. That might be a good one to run to, since it was sort of his return to form, and also for Nobuko Miyamoto, like also her return to, you know, being in front of the camera, and it's again, it's just a nice you know, poking at the way societal conventions, you know, expect people to behave versus the reality of how most people are, and the challenges that we face of just trying to fit into these expectations that are put around us.
And it looks like they also have some behind the scenes videos too. They've got a video about Itami and Miyamoto's collaborations. They've got a making of Tom Popo, and they've got judging from the screenshot. 2016 it was recorded. Miyamoto looking back on Tom Popo, you know, however many years later. So yeah, that if you're on the Criterion streaming service, lots of good places to check out his stuff. So definitely do that. Definitely check out Gentle Art of Japanese Extortion, because this is one movie that a lot of people will not be aware of, and it's a really, like, I found it to be a lot more entertaining than Tom Popo. So I gravitated towards it a lot as well. And if you like these types of, you know, the other thing that's interesting about it is, just thinking about this, is how we were talking about how you've got the classic depictions of the yakuza, then you've got these more comedic ones, and how there are these over the top aspects. And it is kind of funny when you think about how V Cinema kind of merged those two different aspects together, and you get like the really like kind of grindhouse stuff you see from Miike with things like Full Metal Yakuza or Gozu or the Dead or Alive series and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. You know, just, you have lots of different ways in which, you know, cinema can take things on, strip things away. You know, there's just all these different forces that push and pull what types of movies are made and are made accessible to audiences at large.
Okay. Patrick, thanks so much for joining to talk about Minbo and Itami a little bit more in general. Any final things you'd like to say before we close up?
Oh, I mean, nothing specific about this. It was just again a pleasure to be here, and I hope people can go and explore more of Itami's films if they haven't already.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Patrick, thanks so much for coming on again. We got to have you again in the future to talk about another movie.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so that does it for this episode of Japan on Film. Be sure to join us in the next episode. Just checking the calendar here, I believe next time we'll be talking about Blade of the Immortal, the adaptation of the manga, so which I believe was directed by Miike, if I'm remembering offhand. So come join us next time. Meanwhile, you can go to japanonfilm.com, follow us on Twitter. Also, we got a Facebook group. Just type in Japan on Film into the search box. You can easily find us on there. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us, and we will talk to you next time. Thanks for watching this episode of Japan on Film. For more of our videos, just hit the subscribe button.